reading a couple of essays. First, the problem with evil. Actually, the problem is that of language use. Words just correspond to objects, events, and processes. Language is used to describe real things as well as fictitious things. The word evil refers to things that are regarded as bad to human beings and maybe animals in some way. The word evil is usually used to describe some sort of behavior or attitude. Thus, the events or behaviors commonly described as evil certainly exist. One may call it something else, such as new good, bad, bad, instead of evil. However, the real circumstance or event attitude exists anyway, regardless of what it is called. People tend to use or think that words have some kind of Platonic real things for themselves existing out there in some spaced out way, such as that evil exists as a disembodied spirit. That often happens with evil. Incidentally, the Bible uses the term evil to mean bad things, such as tidal waves that wipe out towns, and wicked to refer to evil things that people do, so said the late Vernon J. McGee. Platonic universals refer realistically to word categories, though Plato did also believe that abstract forms of things existed in a realm of forms that could today be thought of as a foray of the mind of God. Definition of existentialism, what morality is, and black hole singularities. Existentialism is the philosophical system developed by Jean-Paul Sartre. He called it a continuation of French rationalism. He examined experience of the cogito and self-awareness from first principles, following in the manner of Descartes in his discourse on a method. He considered everything that he knew directly in his own thought and what he experienced of the world in which he found himself. The principal text of existential philosophy is his book Being and Nothingness, written in Paris during the Second World War. I suppose it is a bit more on the side of German Romanticism and the self-defining ego approach to things developed by followers of Hegel and Kierkegaard, who were followers of Socrates, than on the side of empiricism and naive realism. Logic hasn't morality or moral guidance. It is simply a reasoning tool. There are rules for classical and symbolic logic, yet the wicked can use them as well as computer programs and computational logic too. IBM developed Adolf Hitler's computational card reading devices used for processing Jews in the Holocaust. There is no implicit good in logic, yet logic is a good tool for clear thinking. Morality, on the other hand, is actually what rules people in society actually have. Ethics is how those rules or moral norms are implemented. That is more of a cultural, anthropological view of what morality is. Even so, it's good to have good moral values and challenging sometimes to structure them metasocially. I like the idea that infinities and general relativity that are found when one just continues contracting mass and energy under the influence of gravity seem to have no logical end. Yet obviously gravity is some sort of force or field characteristic, and it is not at all certain that its power continues infinitely reduced. The assumption is for one of the assumptions that the unified field force at very high temperature breaks down all forces into one, a kind of infinite superplasma of no size at all. A string has one dimension and a point, zero dimensions. As they build up, compiling into brains, they have more, and the structure, mass, energy, and space-time coincidentally exists. Apparently, black holes observed in the universe are incomplete processes of infinite reduction to singularity, of zero dimension. Though time appears to stop because of relativistic effects, at the black hole event horizon there are naked singularities too, perhaps, without any event horizon at all. I believe I remember reading. For some reason, there are no black holes that equal anything pre-existing the universe. Existing black holes. In that case, nothing existed at all. The universe was without form and void. Something said for it to begin, or someone, or there was a phase change and a point emerged into the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not, for there was no one yet evolved to think anything about a universe to comprehend. The Jews invaded Canaan, conquered and overcame the walls of Jericho. A clarification, in my opinion. Those critics of the veracity of biblical account of the fall of Jericho to the Jews usually are not well read in the Bible. They claim it's fiction based on naive atheistic fundamentalism way of interpreting the Bible. Since the account is of such importance to those godless atheists determined to defend sin by throwing mud into the Bible, especially the Old Testament, I will reply. First, there are three primary method threads useful for getting to a true opinion of the Jericho incident: history, linguistics, and the archaeological record. One might ask, did the Jews ever really invade and conquer Canaan? Did they have a reason to falsify the Joshua account? Is the alternative explanation or opinion more true? That is, the Jews did not invade Palestine before 1000 BC, never built a temple, and the Dome of the Rock existing today, it doesn't exist and is instead a holograph perpetrated by thieves that float the actual dome on an anti-gravity platform with the need to fool the public. I will use the King James Version for biblical citations and quotes. It was Shakespeare's era of English, was translated from the Greek Septuagint in the 3rd century to 132 BC by 70 Jewish scholars. This is an article by Dr. Woods, who did his PhD dissertation on Bronze Age pottery. He finds Kenyon's recently released final findings off the mark. That is, Catherine Kenyon, written in, I believe it was 1956. It has rigorous scholastic standards, Dr. Woods' criticism, which is at biblicalarchaeology.org, post 2008/5, Did the Israelites Conquer Jericho? A New Look at the Archaeological Evidence, .aspx. I rather like considering some of the history, what is known about the way the books of the Bible were put together with tools of linguistic philosophy and history. Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote in the Blue and Brown books of the problem of the indeterminacy of translation, and the certainty is an issue with some parts of the Old Testament. As I understand it, the Hebrew alphabet wasn't made to exist as the first phonetic written language before 1500 BC. In my opinion, Moses, as a prince of Egypt, was an expert in hieroglyphic writing and Hebrew as well, and when in exile with the Jews, may have wanted to do some writing in the Hebrew language, and so he simply was able to make one up and not write in Egyptian in order to be independent. Having learned the Hebrew language too while in Egypt, making his own written language to write in Hebrew rather than Egyptian is a reasonable guess. Even so, the written language would have had huge gaps and an inadequate vocabulary for hundreds of years. It would have been slow to develop enough scribes to learn, teach, and expand the project. In the Old Testament book of the Pentateuch were assembled the court of Solomon and Jeroboam circa 1000 BC. The Old Testament books were assembled there hundreds of years after the events recorded in Joshua. They may have kept scraps and scrolls started by Moses and continued. It has been speculated that 4 different authors put together the Pentateuch or revised it or redacted it. Some of the Old Testament may have been worked on as late as the 5th century BC. I believe that much material existed from ancient times, but the idea of adding it to a formal group of books was a project that evolved under divine guidance rather than with a master secular plan. The value of the archaeological records is contingent upon an interpretation of the book Joshua account, or at least the contentiousness is built on finding differences between archaeological, historical, and written accounts. It is safe to say that the Jews conquered Canaan sometime, including Joshua, before the time of King David. Jericho was the most important city in early Canaan and was probably known far and wide for its city walls. To conquer Jericho would entail overcoming its walls. The Greeks overcame the walls of Troy with deceit. The part of the contention is that Catherine Kenyon found that the city of Jericho was vacated after conquest, and the contention is over the dates. The controversy was in 1500 BC, 1400 BC, 1100 BC, or briefly in 1300 BC. In contrast, pre-Columbian cities in North America had no city walls except for one small walled city found in North Dakota, I believe it was, where a slaughter was discovered to have occurred in battle. That aside, the lack of walled cities exemplifies that the development of defense was walls require particular social circumstances, including frequent invaders and location. Walmart found the value of walls along frequently traveled routes as ways as a symbol for useful for making money, and it happened to be the name of the fellow Walton. Sam Walton. The account of Jericho had to enter the written record sometime. Moses is thought to be the progenitor of the first 5 books, Pentateuch, that made it down through centuries to David, who may actually have been the guy that started the project to get the Old Testament assembled. There was a prophecy that someone who fits prophecy, such as David, would be working on his material. Who wrote the book of Joshua? Joshua himself seems to compose part of the work. A Bible scholar looked into the issue somewhat and published an article at bible.org/articles/introduction-book-Joshua. Keep in mind that the Hebrew alphabet might not yet have been fully developed, and in Wittgenstein's paradigm of the indeterminacy of translation, the meaning of the Joshua account may be amiss. For example, if there wasn't an adequate word symbol for beat, victory, or trashed, the writer, whoever it was, who may or may not have been an eyewitness, summarized the event for ordinary understanding of people of the day. Hence, Joshua broadcast psyop music at Jericho for 7 days. The walls came down. That is, they surrendered to defeat Jericho, meant to overcome the walls. It could have been a synonym for victory. The walls came down, completely disambiguated for all near and far, even though they might have, it was the equivalent of Manuel Noriega giving up to loud music, driving him out. Of course, one might wonder how many stones for city walls to fall would need to fall. Would it have been adequate for a section of the wall to collapse? If 5 stones were all that were left standing, would that falsify the account? The entire episode appears to be one of advanced psychological operations against the Canaanites holding the interior lines inside the walled city. For 7 days, an armed party circled the city with a loud horn or vuvuzela type of noise-making device, or perhaps a shofar, making a fearsome or strange sound. Or impressive, given all the time the invaders may have become terrified and undermined sections of their own walls, or at least the descending element may have. When the great shout rose in the 7th day, fear and terror was at a max, and someone pulled the keystones out, letting the breach in the walls occur, and the Jews poured through. So the people shouted, Joshua 6:20, when the priests blew with the trumpets. And it came to pass, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. End of quote. It seems to be excellent history for the day. The uncertainty of the exact meaning, together with uncertainty about the line of communication from an historical event to inclusion in the Talmud by ancient and no longer existent scrolls sources, make it a fairly high quality account in my thought. Critics, of course, prefer a naive realist interpretation of the Bible, taking it all literally as ancient biblical literals. They don't go far in consideration of the circumstances of Bible construction at all.